is waste? It's usually something material that remains and is unwanted after we have taken what we value. So it's an unwanted byproduct of creating or using something. We're familiar with waste packaging and waste food, but waste is a verb as well as a noun. We waste when we use something carelessly and to unnecessary excess. So we know about wasting water and energy. We all use toilets, so we're familiar with our own waste, but usually we don't think about where it goes once we flush, or not flush in case it's this most excellent composting toilet. Maybe we put our plastic, glass and paper wastes in the recycling bin, but other than perhaps feeling slightly virtuous, probably we haven't thought much about what happens next, until we learnt recently that much of it is now heading for landfills since China has declined to take it. Our decisions in the first instance to consume something presents a likelihood that certain wastes will result. Buying takeaway food or drink, or clothes that are soon out of fashion, newspaper once we've read it, a car that involves a lot of metal and energy in its manufacture, and a lot more energy and pollution to drive it, and adds to the waste pile, as do the white goods that reach their built-in obsolescence, and so on. We consume clothing and food purchased from retail stores mostly without thinking about what the manufacturing and transport of individual items has involved. A new spotlight, excuse the pun, has been put on clothing, and especially fashion in recent years. In the wake of the explosion in global trade, there's now increasing awareness of supply chain and downstream issues, to use the jargon. This translates to as things like the vast water consumption in producing cotton products, the exposure of exploited workers in developing countries to dangerous conditions, the huge volumes of fast fashion going to landfills, the contribution of synthetic fabrics to pollution, including the microplastic fibres that find their way into rivers and the sea. So, our contemporary lifestyles, the cultural expectations that surround us, the prevailing technologies, the marketing of products, the structure of our cities, towns and neighbourhoods, and the choices that we make inevitably lead to levels of waste and pollution that are unsustainable. They can't be solved comprehensively by either more environmentally friendly technologies or by environmental regulations managed by people like myself. Our modern urban societies have a very forgetful culture, out of sight, out of mind. We drive cars, fly in planes, run air conditioners, and so contribute to the increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere without coming to terms with the cost to the planet. Do you remember when life used to be simpler? Perhaps not easier, but simpler. Reaching back from the 1980s to the 1970s, 60s, 50s, 40s and 30s, there were fewer consumer choices, much simpler technologies, less sophisticated marketing influencing our choices, and generally much lower disposable incomes. My parents' experience in growing up in working class households during the 1930s and through the Second World War certainly ingrained in them a frugality that was necessary and that rubbed off on me to an extent, though it has faded. We are all sinners, and many of us are environmental sinners to some degree. The best way to reduce waste is to avoid the choices that result in wastes. Not that everyone has a lot of choices or is capable of making an informed choice, even if the relevant information is readily available. Poverty constrains choice, but that's another topic. Recycling still occurs in some places in Asia. More relevant here is the challenge we all share to give attention, as best we can, to the consequences of our consumer choices. We can't worry about everything, but we can apply some common sense, making use of information that is available to us about what wastes may be involved and what the long-term impacts may be. So we need to weigh up convenience versus giving attention and making an effort. When we make choices about transport or our energy supply and use, or what we do about garden pests, or how we dispose of batteries, or whether low packaging options are available, we need to be mindful of whether we are contributing to the deterioration of the environment and ultimately the planet. If we can't avoid waste, we could be thinking about how we can reduce our waste footprint through our choices, and then, once we've done that, how we can reuse or recycle the waste we do generate, or maybe sell or give our used goods to others. We can talk about the practical opportunities this afternoon. Opportunities like wearing a plastic bag as a hat in this photographic echoing Flemish masters caught my eye in London. Mahatma Gandhi put the real challenge very plainly: to live simply that others may simply live. We might think that this call to simplicity or frugality was relevant to India 50 or 70 years ago, but it's not very relevant to people living in developed societies like ours. But its relevance to us is worth grappling with, especially when we turn our attention to consider what sort of planet we are leaving our children and grandchildren and all members of future generations, as well as other species. The text from Isaiah 24 this morning is confronting when we consider that it's not only an apocalyptic telling of God's anger towards disobedient people, but a foretelling of the havoc that humanity is wreaking on the planet. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. The Gospels call us to a life of simplicity grounded in the love of God. I, for one, find this very hard. But I, with you, can draw inspiration of the overflowing generosity of God, as we heard from the words of John this morning. And I also found helpful Jesus' words recounted in Matthew 6. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust consumes and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Trevor. I wonder how many people here watched the War on Waste on the ABC. Yeah, a few of us. This second series has examined again the small individual actions that together are making a desolation of our planet. Last week in Trevor's spot, we examined the idea of biodiversity, particularly thinking about extinctions. Now, there are a variety of reasons why species are becoming extinct, but for some, particularly things in the marine environment, waste is a cause of extinction. There are other forms of waste, such as air pollution and chemical runoff, and we've been seeing this in our own neck of the woods, haven't we, with the problem they're experiencing in Footscray and the issue with Stony Creek. Now, that waste isn't a case of things being tossed away, but rather the waste created by something done for the best of reasons. But it is still waste, and it is laying waste to an area, just as Isaiah describes. Waste is a problem for ourselves, for others, and for the whole ecosystem. Our planet is groaning with waste. Waste is also a relatively new phenomenon. For millions of years, all the waste was organic, and it broke down into something that fed another organism. It was a closed system. There were, of course, other things that laid waste, particularly volcanoes of ash, lava and rock, and ice ages, and the other naturally occurring phenomena. But all of them, while devastating in the short term, were productive in the long term. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been taking the things of the earth and using them to create other substances that are not either feeding the organic system or that are being produced in such quantity that now the organic system cannot deal with them. Or some, like plastic, which the organic material is so changed in its nature that it is impossible to return it to its component parts. And plastic is looming as the single biggest problem that we're facing. Human beings, of course, have always produced waste, but for most of our existence we've produced waste that does not return quickly to the earth at a relatively slow rate and small quantity. In our own lifetimes, the increase has been exponential, hasn't it? Many of us in this room grew up in a world where the small things were all recycled or repurposed, and the big things were worth money, so somebody collected them and used them. We grew up on waste not, want what not, didn't we? Yeah. I was doing some research recently, and I discovered that in the recent past in urban areas, the rag and bone man who came around in a cart. Now, I'd heard of the rag and bone man, but I didn't really know what he did. So I discovered that he would take absolutely anything and everything that he could get his hands on. He would take your broken crockery, any metal of any description, bones and rags, obviously, and all sorts of other things. There was also the night soil cart that collected, well, you can imagine. All these things were repurposed in some way, and many were reused in industrial purposes. There were, of course, even then repercussions. There were things that got burnt. Who had a backyard incinerator? All of us. And that caused problems. Water was polluted, and I mean the Thames was so polluted you could almost walk on it. But the scale of the disaster has grown to a point where we need to take action urgently and action on a large scale. The idea of humans laying waste to their environment has always been a very active one. In the psalm that we read, we had a picture of people laying waste to the temple and the sanctuary, and the kind of destruction of war always takes quite a bit of time for recovery. Unfortunately, we're still seeing this kind of devastation. In recent times, we've seen images on our television of the cities of Syria just laid waste, haven't we? And destruction of temples in Pakistan, the libraries and museums of Mosul. This creates a huge and devastating problem of waste, quite apart from the cost to human beings. The kind of thing that we're doing in wealthier countries in peacetime is a more passive, you might say, destruction of our environment. In Isaiah 24, God is the agent who is laying waste, and it's an equal punishment on everyone, master and slave, buyer and seller. And his description sounds mighty like the kind of droughts that we experience. The earth dries up and withers. The world languishes and withers. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants. It's a picture of devastation, as Trevor said. And we, in our day and age, are bringing it upon ourselves. Now, the worst thing that struck me in their predicament in Isaiah, who else picked it up? It's a lack of wine. And you know, we may reach that state too if we fail to conserve plant species, if we keep wasting water, if we fail to look after our bees. The people in Isaiah are punished because they have transgressed laws, they have violated statutes, and they have broken the everlasting covenant. And in our world, just as in theirs, the devastation will affect everyone. At the moment, however, the rural and the poor in our country and overseas, the people of the third world countries, are the ones who are bearing the brunt. We ship many of our problems offshore. We buy things produced in third world nations and we leave the residue behind. We encourage others to pollute in order that we might have cheap goods. And then we dump those cheap goods in landfill, which is growing to be a significant problem here as in other countries. A measure of our standard of living is how much we throw away. And when you think about that, it's a very poor standard of living that fouls its own nest and also the nests of others. It's very interesting that the word Jesus uses when he speaks about going to hell, that is, the word is Gehenna, and Gehenna is the rubbish dump in a valley outside Jerusalem, where the rubbish that couldn't be used was dumped and a fire constantly burnt. Bodies, as well as household and industrial waste, were burnt there. So that image of the weeping and wailing of teeth and the flames of destruction is a literal one. And you know, our huge landfill sites could equally be viewed as hell. And indeed, if you were to talk to the poor of Addis Ababa or Manila, who live on the rubbish heaps, they might well describe the place where they're living as hell. If the scale of our waste problem is confronting, then surely we should consider the root cause. And that, of course, is consumerism. The consumerism that demands more and more at less and less cost. Our world is driven by market forces, and at the moment it's uneconomic to recycle. So instead, we, and by we I mean China and other growing manufacturers, continue to produce from raw materials the plastics and other disposable products that our hearts crave, and we who don't produce them buy them and then dispose of them. And they're stockpiled into ever-growing collections of glass, e-waste, paper, recyclable plastic, all just going literally to waste. Many of us in this room can remember a time when plastic was new, can't we? There's people nodding. And when synthetic fibres were a novelty. I remember my sister complaining that all the other girls had a nylon petticoat, and she didn't. Now our street collections, if you walk down the road, are full of plastic items that are broken and useless. And because of our wealth, when a plastic product is broken or even just old or daggy, we discard it and buy something new. None of this plastic goes away. It just breaks down into smaller and smaller bits and kills our plants and animals, particularly, of course, fish, as we know. This is not God's plan for creation. This is breaking the covenant of stewardship that Bishop Allison talked about in the first week of our season of creation. When we turn to that passage from John, the feeding of the 5,000, there are a couple of principles in regard to this matter that we might take from it. The first is that God's generosity is a response to need. We must consider the needs of others and not the wants of ourselves, and respond in the same way a small boy did in sharing what we have. The second principle that I think we can draw from it is that Jesus orders them, at the end of that story, to gather up everything that is left over so that nothing is wasted. Jesus' care extends beyond the immediate need to the next need and to the welfare of all. Now, in that lovely reading from 2 Corinthians, Paul, who's been giving the Corinthians a real serve about their lack of care for each other, tells them that the love of Christ urges us on. We need to respond to this desperate situation of waste because of the love of Christ for each human being and for God's beautiful creation. Paul says that there is hope because everything old has become new. Now, I don't think that Paul was talking specifically about recycling, but indeed a transformation of our very selves through the work of the Holy Spirit. We should pray that the spirit of acquisitiveness in us that causes us to consume and waste might be transformed. We must pray that God's incredible generosity might be rooted and grow in us so that we can live wholeheartedly loving God and loving our neighbours and caring for God's wondrous creation. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.